Session number 4. Like the alphabet, the next greatest invention in humanity was the printing press, because it changed the world again. When Gutenberg invented printing around 1450, it froze the process of change from handwritten manuscript to handwritten manuscript. Now, the first book that he published was the Bible. And so now, instead of the existence of a limited number of handwritten manuscripts that were only accessible to the learned, the printing press flooded Europe and ultimately the rest of the world with Bibles. That caused a revolution. It brought us out of the Dark Ages because our ideas were no longer fettered. Schools could teach more students, libraries could open, scholars could publish their ideas, and peers could review them. It changed the power structures that had oppressed the world ideologically, theologically, politically, and the next step after that would affect the world as much would be the internet. I'd like to go into the next phase of the transmissions of the text because we're going to talk about the critical Greek text. And a lot of people throw this term around. And so I would like to define it and explain it because a lot of people say, oh, it's not in the critical Greek text, and everybody goes, oh, wow. Well, what does that mean? And if you're going to throw that term around, if you're going to say something is not in the text, from the back of the room, in your mind's ear, you will hear my voice, prove it! Every time you say it's not in the text, you're going to hear, prove it! Okay, don't throw that term around. Make sure you can utilize it. Make sure you understand it. See, critical does not mean that it makes fun of or it finds fault with. It means it looks at it in detail from an objective viewpoint to determine how sound the text is. A critical text is a hypothetical text made up of excerpts from manuscripts, from the documents that we do have. This hypothetical text will represent what the writer thought that the text would be like. Okay? Either one of the writers claimed that his was reflecting what the original text read. Another one of them claimed that his critical Greek text reflected what the Bible was like in the 4th century. With a critical text, it has this hypothetical text that the scholar has put together that he thinks that the original was or whatever, based upon the manuscript evidence. And then what they do is they have an apparatus of footnotes that cite specific manuscripts. And this apparatus is abbreviated and with symbols. These critical texts can be of the Bible or of the classical Greek writers, or one time I was doing a computer installation for somebody at the University of Akron, and we got started talking. He was an English professor, and his claim to fame was he did critical text evaluations of the writings of Shakespeare. They were handwritten manuscripts too, see. You can have a lot of different critical texts. Now, how is the text made? Scholars constructed what they thought the archetype, or the original, was based upon manuscript evidence. They compared manuscripts one with another, and then they noted the difference between the different readings, and then they used textual detective work to try to figure out what the original read. For example, like what we did with Revelation 19, where we thought through logically what the original could have been and probably was based upon logic. That was the process used with textual criticism. And then they would footnote their evidence in manuscripts. See, this indeed is a subject where we stand on the shoulders of those who have gone before us. We have a lot of wonderful, wonderful research available to us. I like the Berry's interlinear. Now, this is my little version, and you can see I've read it to pieces. And it's the little version of the interlinear, so I call it my little linear. In here, it compares a number of different critical Greek texts. Here, this is a critical Greek text. It's called the UBS text. Here's another one. This is the Nestle-Aland critical Greek text. What they are is where these scholars put them together based upon manuscript evidence, and then they footnote the manuscripts in here. So what I want to do is go through a history of these so that you'll understand more about them. Now, another really good book to consult when it comes to this is Greenlee's book, Introduction to New Testament Textual Criticism. Bruce Metzger also wrote a textual commentary on the Greek New Testament, and what that is, it's a companion volume to the UBS text. The UBS text was made by a committee of 5 scholars, no more than that, I think. Well, there's several different editions of the UBS. I think the original was 5. And what they did in their committee is they discussed all these different manuscripts, and so they gave their reasoning for why they thought the text should read one way based upon the evidence. And so some secretary wrote that all down, and then Metzger edited it, and then there's a companion volume that has all the logic in it. Very interesting. So if you want to learn about that, that's where you can go. Also on the internet, there is something called an Encyclopedia of New Testament Textual Criticism, and he has all kinds of links to all kinds of different things regarding this subject. And so you can find a lot of stuff at your fingertips. Now, when you go out onto the internet, which is a valuable resource nowadays, I need to caution you because there is a website out there that a lot of people use and they think it's really good. It's called Wikipedia. You may have heard of it, but I need to caution you about Wikipedia because since it is an open source and a lot of people can contribute, there are some scholars who have a bone to pick with it because they don't control the content well enough. And these scholars purposefully submit erroneous material. My wife knows of one who brags about it. That's terrible, but that's what you get when you have that kind of thing. So, in fact, it is notorious for this to the point where at most colleges, if you footnote Wikipedia in your paper, you get a red mark. You can go there and look at it. What I would do if you did use it is look at their footnotes and then go to the footnotes and get the material. Don't take their word for it because it could be one of these things where they just have tried to mess around with it. Now, what's very interesting is that I told you that there were 24,000 manuscripts that exist for Greek, New Testament biblical manuscripts. Now, among these 24,000 manuscripts, if you looked at all the different variations in them and counted them all up, there are about 150,000 variations amongst these 24,000 manuscripts. 99% of those 150,000 variations are just spelling, word order, things that don't affect the meaning. So therefore, there's only about 1% where we really have to center in, about 1,500 instances that need deeper detective work. Now that's pretty good. So right off the bat, even without a critical text, we could say that the Bible that we have now is 99% what the original was. That's pretty good. But with the critical text and with the textual detective work, I think we can get much, much, much closer. When the first Greek text was printed and circulated, a debate arose amongst the scholarly people because they wanted to find out whether it was accurate or not. What were the texts that it was based upon? And scholars and students started to travel all over Europe and the Middle East, visiting libraries, archives, monasteries, looking for manuscripts. Because before this time, the Latin Vulgate reigned supreme, and Greek was sort of an afterthought. But when the first text was published, they saw that it was much more accurate, much more clear than the Latin Vulgate. And so a big debate started, and these scholars started looking for manuscripts. I even know somebody who discovered a manuscript. They had studied in University of Chicago under Dr. Arthur Bubis, or Fabus, I guess is how you pronounce it. And he would go and visit monasteries and Christian places all over the Middle East, something that you can't do today. He would go to Syria and Iraq and Iran and develop relationships with the different Christian institutions there, and he would ask them if they had any ancient texts, and then when they showed them to him, he would photograph them and help them to preserve it. And so this friend of mine studied under Dr. Vubis, and he did the same thing. He ended up in Egypt. He visited an old Christian site, asked them if they had any manuscripts, and they said, well, yeah, we have one. And so the librarian showed him a single page, and it was very old. And so this person helped them preserve it by putting it between two panes of glass and taping the sides, because they didn't have too many resources there, so he did the best he could. And then he photographed it and later discovered that it was a missing page from a 6th century manuscript that is housed in the British Museum. Now, the first Greek Bible was published in 1516 by Erasmus. Erasmus published his Greek text side by side with the Vulgate, and once people saw it and compared the Greek text with the Latin Vulgate, they immediately saw that it was much better. That lit a fire that would not be quenched. Erasmus had grown up in close contact with a monastery, and he had been exposed to the hypocrisies of the monks. Consequently, he didn't hold them in very high esteem. And this air about him affected him for the rest of his life because he was independent. When he grew up, he received the best education that he could, and he continued to be critical of the excesses of the Roman Catholic Church. He was ordained a priest, but he never really functioned as one. Instead, he plied his talents to live the life of an independent scholar. There was a believer in England who encouraged him to become a quote-unquote primitive theologian. In other words, to study the original scriptures and not commentaries. And Erasmus fell in love with the Word. He wrote him later, "I cannot tell you how I hurry on with all sails set to holy literature, how I dislike everything that keeps me back or retards me." So that's the heart of Erasmus. Now, he avoided any formal ties that might inhibit his freedom of expression, and he was in favor of something very radical, that the Bible should be translated into the languages of the people. However, Erasmus, even though he lived in the midst of the Protestant Reformation, when there was a huge upheaval in Europe, he wanted to try to reform the church from within instead of leaving it. And so he kept pushing for having the Bible translated into the language of the people. He said, "I would that these were translated into every language. I would that the farmer might sing snatches of Scripture at his plow, and the weaver might hum phrases of Scripture to the tune of his shuttle, that the traveler might lighten with stories from Scripture the weariness of his journey." It was said that Erasmus laid the egg that Luther hatched, because when he published the Greek New Testament, like I said, it changed Europe. Although later on, when the Roman Catholics challenged Erasmus about that, he said, "Well, I expected it to hatch a different kind of bird." But it was inevitable that once the Bible was available in the language of the people, that they would begin to question the authority of the Roman Catholic Church that had kept the word from them. Now, Erasmus's Greek text was the first one to be printed or published, but it was not the first one to be printed. There was another book that was in the process of being printed called the Complutensian Polyglot. Polyglot, many tongues. It had Greek and Hebrew and Latin in different columns, and it was from Complutum. You know where that is, right? It had been printed earlier, but it was held up at the publisher to get permission from the Pope and also to be proofread. It was finally published in 1522, 6 years after Erasmus's text. See, Erasmus had learned of this publication, and he had hooked up with another publisher who encouraged him to get it done first. So they raced through it. He found just a few Greek manuscripts, and he collated them, which means he looked at all the differences and cataloged the differences. And so then he published his text. The manuscripts that he used were not very old, and actually he had everything except the last 6 verses of Revelation. He did not have a Greek text with those last 6 verses, so he grabbed the Vulgate and translated back from the Latin into Greek to get those last 6 verses. His first edition sold out really quick, and so his second and third editions, containing the corrections, etc., were widely distributed across Europe. The first English translation printed and the first German translation printed were based on Erasmus's Greek text. The next critical text was written or put together by Robert Estienne. His Roman Catholic name was Stephanus. That's from which we get the Stephen's text. He grew up in a family of printers, and he had earned the ire of the Roman Catholic Church when he published a quote-unquote corrected Vulgate. They didn't like that. And so they didn't want it printed. They didn't want a lot of things printed like that because it might fall into the hands of the common man and they would lose their franchise on interpreting the Bible for people. And so because of this corrected version, they dogged him the rest of his life. And this will turn out to be a pattern that we will see with almost every one of these scholars who managed to publish a critical text. He published a French Bible in 1553, and they really loved him for that too. But he published his first critical text, and his third version contained variant readings from 15 manuscripts, including Erasmus and the Complutensian Polyglot. They were not very old, and his text was almost exactly like Erasmus. In his fourth edition, he added verse divisions that are still used in Bibles today. The chapter divisions were later. No, actually, they were earlier. The chapter divisions had been introduced in the 11th century. His third edition, that had the widest distribution, became known as the quote-unquote received text, the official text in Great Britain and the United States. The next critical text was by Theodore Beza. He was a French scholar, and during 1565 to 1604, he published several editions. He had one other thing in common with these people who published Greek texts, and that is that they were what I call Wunderkinder. They were wonder children. They were very brilliant young children. They were precocious. That's the term that I'm searching for. And he got the best education possible, developed a hunger for the truth, and he was an independent thinker, which is another trait of these people. When he became born again, he severed all his ties with people in Paris and the sources of his income. He moved to Geneva and hooked up with John Calvin and became an important person in the Calvinistic Protestant movement. He did a critical text. He found a very early manuscript, a 5th century manuscript. He didn't really cite it a whole lot because most of the manuscripts that were cited at that time were late versions, and they were almost all the same. And so the Stephen's text was based on inferior Greek texts. They weren't very ancient. And everybody that followed suit didn't want to depart too much because the Stephen's text had started to gain favor as the quote-unquote official text. His text was similar to Erasmus and Estienne. Now, if you've got one of these Berry's interlinears, the text that is in the main body is the Stephen's text. Then they have footnotes that compare the Stephen's text with the other critical texts. And from time to time, you'll see a note for a B text. Not very many of them because there aren't very many differences, but the B is Beza's critical text. The next one is the E in the Berry's interlinear, and this is the Elsevier Brothers. They also were printers, and basically they were not scholars like the rest of them. Their venture into this field was purely to make money. They published a critical text that was almost a duplicate of Beza's text, it only differed in 50 places. And in their introduction, the publisher said that you are now receiving the text received by all, in which we have not altered or corrupted anything. And so this became known as the received, quote unquote, text for Europe. And this quote that I gave you was written in Latin. So the Latin words for received text are textus receptus. That's the received text. And it became known as the quote unquote official text in Europe. The most popular Bible translations in English and French and Spanish, etc., were based on this received text. As more and more manuscripts were discovered in archives and other places, and earlier manuscripts were found, then the evidence got better and better. However, since most of the founding Bibles in the Protestant churches and in the European languages were based upon this received text, as the manuscript evidence became better and better, there was resistance against improvements because of the traditions that had been based upon the translations of the Bible that were the earliest ones. And what's interesting is if you go out onto the internet, you're going to see a huge amount of information on people who say that the King James Bible is the best version of the Bible and all the other versions are corrupt, and that the received text is the official text and it is much better, and all of these other critical Greek texts that I'm going to tell about are from the devil and they're terrible. And see, there's a huge amount of information. If you just went out on the internet, you'd be inundated with so much of this stuff that if you didn't know any better, you could be swayed by these people. And their modus operandi is to be very derogatory towards anyone who differs with them. And I'll explain more about that. I call them the King James boys, or the Textus Receptus gang. You know, I like King James too. I mean, I use it, but the reason I use it is not why they say I should. I use it because there are more reference books based on King James than any other version. But it's not the best translation. We'll discuss that in another session. But, you know, I quote from it because, you know, it's a standard text. I think that the Greek and Hebrew that stands behind it is closer to the Word of God than anything that we have in English. I'd rather go back to the texts and read them and research them. I believe that when the Bible was first written, it had no contradiction, that it was perfect. And with that basis, we can look at the variants, assuming that there were no contradictions in the original, and then we can use textual detective work to try to figure out what the original was. The Textus Receptus people would hound all of the rest of these scholars from then on. On page 40 in your syllabus, it talks about John Mill. He was the first scholar to do an in-depth attempt to use textual criticism. He spent 30 years, he researched 78 manuscripts and cited over 30,000 variations in his critical text. He died about 2 weeks after it was published. He only proposed a few changes to the quote-unquote received text, but he backed them up with huge amounts of information. But even though he had all of this huge amount of information, his text was received with violent criticism. He just wanted to look for truth. But you see, before this time, most of the manuscripts that were used by these former critical texts were not very old, and he was the first one to cite readings from a large number of sources. Also, at that time was when the earliest manuscript that had been found came to light, which is called Codex Alexandrinus. It's a 5th century unsealed text. It had been in the possession of the Greek Orthodox Church for centuries, but it came to light, someone that was looking for manuscripts noised abroad, we're looking for manuscripts, and they said, oh, we've got one. They'd had it for a long time before then. Despite the intense attack that he had received because he varied from the official text, he broke the ground for further advances in textual criticism. Later on in 1734, John Albert Bengel followed up on John Mill's work and proposed that there be families of texts, because there were some earlier manuscripts and some later manuscripts, and some of the readings in the earlier manuscripts showed up in later ones. And so they said, well, the later one must have been copied from this earlier one, or maybe there might have been a couple in between, but they were related. So he proposed the existence of families. He said there were two, the African and the Asian. He published 27 suggestions for textual criticism rules, and he's most famous for the prefer the harder reading rule. And what that was is what the monks would do when they had these texts, and they would look at them when they were copying from one manuscript to another. Sometimes they would try to soften things. They would try to say, well, this had to be a mistake, and so I'm going to correct it. Maybe the grammar wasn't quite right, or it just sounded weird to them. And so they would correct it. He proposed that the more hard the reading was, the more difficult the reading was, the less smooth it was probably more close to the original because it was less corrected by these guys who thought they would make the improvement. He said the less theologized or the less harmonized reading was more preferable. Of course, the King James boys loved him for that. Richard Bentley followed it in the same tradition. He said that the scribe is more likely to make a difficult construction easier than make more difficult than what was already easy. And he was proposing that a new text be made because they were finding all of these manuscripts that were different from the Textus Receptus. So he was advocating that somebody needs to get together and make a better critical text. Also during this time, John Wettstein introduced a method to cite manuscripts, and that was that the unsealed manuscripts were indicated in footnotes by capital letters, and the cursive or minuscule manuscripts were indicated by numbers. Later on, Johann Semler added more families, the Alexandrian family, and he renamed the other Asian and African families to Western and Eastern. When they did their textual criticism, they didn't want to consider the theology. They just wanted to look at the logic when it came to these different readings and to logically try to figure out how one was derived from the other. This kind of work attracted those who were independent thinkers. And many of these guys were not in the center of the Christian establishment. That really got the ire of the Textus Receptus crowd. They grouped their rules into two categories, whether they were external evidence or internal evidence. External evidence dealt with the traits of the manuscripts, that is, like the date, and they determined the date of the manuscript by the kind of writing that was used, the kind of ink that was used, the kind of medium, whether it was papyrus or vellum or other media. See, paper was not brought into Europe yet. The Chinese invented paper in about 200 AD. The Islamic people found out about it about 800. Europe didn't find out about it until about 1000. And so they didn't have stuff written on paper very much early on. They would look at the characteristics of the document, maybe where it came from, the geographical distribution, etc. Now, the internal evidence was based upon the logic of the readings themselves. So it dealt with the habits of a particular scribe. If they had a tendency to harmonize, for example, if one text said he went to the store and bought apples, and another text said he went to the store and bought oranges. Well, the scribe didn't know which one was right, so he said he went to the store and bought apples and oranges. That's called a conflation, where they would combine readings. And it's interesting because, some of these changes were made intentionally. Other changes were not made intentionally. For example, one way that they would copy manuscripts is they would do it in what's called a scriptorum. And so you'd have a person reading from the main text, and then each of you were scribes, and you'd be writing down on your Bibles, you'd be copying your manuscript. And so in that case, there could be errors that occurred because of hearing. Maybe one of you were not paying attention when the guy read what he read, and then you thought he read something else, so you write down something different. Or maybe one of you may have misspelt something when you wrote. You understand? Those are kind of errors that occur because of hearing. Then the other way that manuscripts were copied would be on a one-to-one basis, where you'd have one scribe copying from one text to another. And so there you would get errors based upon sight, where you would misread something possibly. Or another kind of error would be if you had two lines that ended with the same two or three consonants, the same two or three letters, or began with the same two or three letters. So then what would happen is that here you are, you're writing this line, and so you write it down here, and when your eye goes back up to the original, you look and you see the ending characters that are the same, but you look at the second line instead of the first. So you skip that line. Oh, I already did that one. So you go on. So you missed a line simply because they ended with the same characters. Does that make sense? So that is an error based upon sight. Those are unintentional things. Then later on, what would happen is that they would check themselves, and maybe they'd find, oh, I made a mistake. Well, what are they going to do? Are they going to, throw away the whole thing? Well, if it was the Masorah, the Masoretes would. They'd throw away that whole page and start over again. But in the New Testament with the Greek, what they would do is they would copy the correction into the margin. So then, 100 years goes by and the Romans come in and they attack the monastery and they burn all the Bibles except the one that has this marginal note in it. But see, the problem is some of the other monks would be reading along and they'd be really blessed with something, and so they'd say, wow, this is great, and they'd put that into the margin. For example, if you go to 1 John chapter 3, I'll show you one. 1 John chapter 3, and in verse 2, it says, behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the sons of God. And there are a bunch of texts that says, and we are. Now, that's kind of, if we're called the sons of God, that should be enough. I don't know why. It just seems a little odd to me that and we are would have been in the original text. But I can see that coming in as a marginal note, where some monk was just so blessed, and we are. And see, then, 100 years later, the monastery's been attacked and all the Bibles have been burned, and here is this little Bible sitting over here in the corner, and they missed that one, and so now they want to use the Bible to copy a new one. And so here they're going along, and they're reading along, and they see this marginal note. Now, was that a correction, or was that a comment? I don't know. So it got copied into the text. You see, that's an unintentional addition. And that's how a lot of things happen. Now, there were some intentional ones, and I'll show you some of those in the future. But that's how all of these readings came to be. And like I said, most of them are spelling or word order changes, and it doesn't change the sense of things. But there were some that definitely did. And so the people who did textual criticism would look at the external evidence, they would look at the internal evidence, and they would use this detective work to correct things. Now, one of the premises of the King James boys and the Textus Receptus gang is called the hypothesis of textual preservation. They believe that God would intervene to preserve the Bible and make sure that it somehow remained intact. So they don't believe that Erasmus's choice of manuscripts was accidental. They would believe that it was by providence. They will not admit that the early scribes corrected things. Now, of course, this is based on an incorrect view of God's position on freedom of will. See, God does not possess, he does not overstep free will. If he did, we'd still be in the Garden of Eden. Free will was the first thing communicated to man in Genesis 2:16. Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat. See, it's a precedent for our relationship. So if a scribe was intent to make a theological addition to the manuscript, God couldn't stop him. He wouldn't stop him. He would overstep his free will. But see, they believed that he would. So that's why they believe that the Textus Receptus is the Word of God, because God was guiding Erasmus to pick these texts that he picked. We can see that that doesn't make sense, because see, man tends to form religious rituals and dogmas from the things that originally were inspired by God. We can see this clearly in the decay that occurred in the Hebrew faith that was recorded in Kings and Chronicles. The prophets were constantly trying to bring the people back, but most of the kings did evil in the sight of the Lord, right? And pretty soon it got so bad that they persecuted Jeremiah. They put him in a cesspool up to here. They killed Isaiah. They sawed him in two. If that happened to the Jews, why didn't it happen to the Christians? You know, what's stopping Christianity from going through the same process that the Jews did that's recorded in the Bible? You understand? So, judging from the doctrinal decay that was represented by what the second century church writers wrote, because it differed so much from the Bible, I can't believe that the Bible has been preserved 100% by textual preservation. There are some things that we've lost, just like in Revelation 19. But still, we can use textual criticism and logic to get back there. I think we can get really, really, really close. But we have to use the principles of textual criticism to get there. The next textual critic was John Griesbach. He is the G in the interlinear. And he collated a large number of manuscripts. That means he looked at all the differences and noted them. He was the first one to apply Bengel's and Semler's recommendations of textual families and textual criticism rules. He said that if 2 out of the 3 families had a reading, it was probably more genuine. Also, he leaned heavily on the text of Codex Alexandrinus, which was the earliest manuscript that had been found. He was very skillful in his logic, but one of the things that he did do that was very bold is there is a section at the end of Mark that a lot of people think was added, and so he was the first one to say it was added and took it out of his critical Greek text. And of course, the Textus Receptus guys just went ape over that. They just went nuts. And so they attacked him terribly. He was called the foe of Orthodox Christianity because he wrote, "The most suspicious reading of all is the one that yields a sense favorable to the nourishment of piety, especially monastic piety," what was practiced by the monks. "When there are many variant readings in one place, that reading which more than others manifestly favors the dogmas of the Orthodox is deservedly regarded as suspicious." And of course, they went nuts over that. But it's true, because the monks would have changed things, and I'll show you where some monk monkeyed with the text and changed it to substantiate his own doctrine. Now, as I said, scholars had fanned all over Europe because they were finding more and more of these manuscripts. And so there was a gentleman, Johann Schultz, who traveled for 12 years visiting libraries throughout Europe. He didn't have time to collate the manuscripts that he found, but what he did is he made an index. An index was a book that listed the characteristics of the manuscripts, what content they had, and where they could be found. So then when he published this index, now the scholars that followed him had a map to follow. And so they rapidly followed in his footsteps and took the time to collate, to catalog all the differences in these manuscripts, and they published them, and a huge amount of information became available. The next critical Greek text was written by Karl Conrad Friedrich Wilhelm Lachmann. He was not a theologian. he was a classical Greek scholar. And so he approached the task of making a critical text of the Bible totally from an independent viewpoint. He just used logic. He had no theology in his background. So his goal was to represent the original, not the original text, but the text as it appeared in the 4th century. Because Richard Bengel had proposed that they abandon all manuscripts written after the 8th century. He said that if they did that, it would take 2,000 errors out of the Pope's Vulgate and as many out of the Protestant Pope Stephanus's text. Other scholars also were maintaining that the earlier the manuscript, the better. So Lockman was the first guy to make this one of his main principles. See, Griesbach had used the textual families, and he said 2 out of 3 is best. Lockman said, well, the earlier, the better. And so he only cited unsealed manuscripts and the oldest ones. Now, when he did his work, his text did not turn out to be that much different from Textus Receptus. Because remember I told you there are 150,000 errors, 99% of them are just spelling and word order. Only 1,500 are substantial. And so when he came up with his text without the theology in it and all that other stuff, it still was pretty close to Textus Receptus, but it was based on better textual criticism. But he made an error in judgment because when he published his critical text, he did not explain how he had arrived at it. He didn't put his criteria and his rules why he chose what he chose. He didn't put that in his preface. And so he just published this text, and the Textus Receptus guys went nuts. They just said, anathema, curse. And so in his second edition, then he did explain his principles. The next one is Constantin Tischendorf. Now, Tischendorf is the greatest name in textual criticism. He was inspired by a Greek teacher, and he decided to take on the quote-unquote sacred task of struggling to regain the original form of the New Testament, and he dedicated his life to this task. He decided to launch on this thing and go out and find these texts. So he got some funding and basically lived by faith and went from college to college and did tasks here and there. And when he finished, he looked back at how much money he had spent, and it was 50 times what he had started out with. But he gained it because of the work that he did, and he just believed to get financed to go on to the next task. And you remember that one text, the palimpsest I showed you, where it was written and then scraped and then rewritten? He deciphered that. And when he deciphered that, his name became very well known, so he got a lot of backing. His most famous discovery was Codex Sinaiticus, the earliest unsealed text found at that time. It's a 4th century text. I've got in here an account. What he would do in these later years, he would travel around after he had discovered Codex Sinaiticus, and people would have him tell the story about how he found it. Because he found himself at St. Catherine's Monastery in Mount Sinai, and he would ask if they had any old texts and stuff. And so when he got there, they said, yeah, we have some old texts. In fact, we're throwing them out. And so he looked in the trash bin, and he found pages from an unsealed text that was earlier than he had ever seen. And he said, gosh, don't throw these away. And he got so excited about it that the monk said, maybe this is worth something. So they only gave him about 1/3 of the sheets that were in there, and they kept all the rest. And so he kept coming back to that monastery trying to find the rest of it. He finally had been there, I think it was his 3rd trip, and he told his camel drivers to get ready to leave the next day. And so that afternoon he was taking a walk with the steward of the convent, and they got home, and the guy invited into his little cubicle for something to drink. While they were talking and chit-chatting, he said, well, I have a Bible too. And he went to this little niche in the wall and took out this book that was wrapped in cloth and gave it to Tischendorf, and Tischendorf went ballistic, but only on the inside because he'd learned his lesson. And he was holding in his hands the oldest Bible that had ever been found, Codex Sinaiticus. And so it tells how he was just so full of joy. You know, he said, well, would you let me take it back to my room and look at it? Trying to be as nonchalant as possible. And so the guy said, yeah, go ahead. And so when he got back to his room, that's where he just went, he was just so excited because he had found this. And he started reading it, and he found stuff in there that it did not exist in any other Bible. Oh, he was just so excited. He wanted to try to take the book with him. But the prior of the monastery had left town. He was on his way to Constantinople. Tischendorf got his camel drivers to get ready and hurry to Cairo, where this prior was staying for a short while before he went on to Constantinople. And so he said, could you let me have this Bible to take to my guys so we can make transcriptions of it, and then I'll give it back to you? And the guy said, yeah, go ahead. And so they sent a messenger back, riding his camel as fast as he could, back to Mount Sinai from Cairo, and they got the book with the written permission of the prior. And so then he and his guys in Cairo transcribed the 110,000 lines of the book in about 2 weeks or so. They just voraciously went through this and collated, because they didn't know how long that they would let him have it. Now, later on, he kind of conned the guy out of it, but he became the most famous textual critic, because what he did is he found this Codex Sinaiticus, and then he published a critical text that had more variants that were recorded in it than any other version. And it's still a very useful volume, especially his 8th edition. Tregelles was the next textual critic. He also worked with Tischendorf from time to time. And during this time, after Tischendorf had found Codex Sinaiticus, and the whole scholarly world went ape when he found it. They were just so excited because it was from the 4th century. The Vatican said, well, we have one too. You do? Yeah, we've had it for a while. Well, we didn't want to let anybody know about it. Tischendorf tried to go see it, and they posted a guard, and they searched him for any pen and paper, so he couldn't take notes. And the guard would take the text away from him if he looked too long at any one page. This was Codex Vaticanus from the 5th century. Later on, Tregelles looked at this. Let's see. One of them was able to finally collate it. But Tregelles had a lot of information from Codex Vaticanus in his critical text. He also got the boot from the Textus Receptus crowd, because he was deviating from the received text. He's the TR in the Berry's Interlinear. Henry Alford was the next person who published a critical text. Now, what Alford's famous for is he said, the word has to make sense. Duh. Because these other guys, they were just looking at the internal evidence and the external evidence and approaching it from a dispassionate, objective viewpoint. But what Alford did is he said, well, the word has to make sense. You have to choose the reading that fits with the rest of the Bible. Duh. That's a pretty good thing. And so he is the A in Berry's Interlinear. And then finally, you have Wordsworth. He's the W. And he sort of reacted against what Alford did. He said Alford was too liberal. After that, you got Westcott and Hort. Now, throughout this whole time, you had this big battle going on between these scholars who thought independently, who did their best work, their best thinking, trying to figure out what the original text meant, and they published the critical texts. On the other hand, you had the Textus Receptus guys that were just saying terrible things, assailing their character and telling everybody they were just terrible people because they were corrupting the Bible, because they were saying that certain things weren't in the text. And so you get Westcott and Hort, who about 1881 published a critical text. Now, Westcott and Hort made some assumptions that later on turned out to not be true. And on one hand, their critical text was very scholarly, and they won a lot of people over to their side. But on the other hand, because of some of these assumptions that they made, they fueled the fire of the Textus Receptus crowd. A champion for the Textus Receptus boys arose. Thomas Boyles, I think his name was. I've got it here in the notes. Basically, the Textus Receptus guys and the Westcott and Hort people, it came to a head where their arguments were the older the better versus the majority speaks the loudest. The older the better was more logical. Because, see, of these 24,000 manuscripts, most of them were newer than the 8th century. And they had all these additions in them. The Textus Receptus guys said, well, the majority says this, but the majority were the younger texts. There was a champion, John Burgeon, who was a believer in the biblical preservation theory. He was really hacked off that they decided that they wanted to make it official to drop the last 12 verses of the Gospel of Mark. And so he started publishing some really strongly worded articles, and his positions became the basis for the modern King James only movement. And basically they followed his lead because they defend the Textus Receptus and they condemn and vilify anyone who disparages it. That's their modus operandi. And if you get out on the internet, you will see it in vivid color. After Westcott and Hort, the next critical text was by Eberhard Nestle. For years I pronounced it Nestle, N-E-S-T-L-E, but I found out he wanted it pronounced Nestle. Eberhard Nestle, it's the Nestle text. So what he did is he compared Westcott and Hort and Tischendorf and Tregelles. He had a goal of publishing an inexpensive text so that Greek students and not just scholars would have it. His text went through it has now gone through 27 editions. That's this one right here. This is the Nestle Aland text. It's been taken over by Kurt Aland and now his wife, and they are coming out with the 28th edition soon. Von Soden was the next critical text in 1902, but his was a great disappointment because he had received an endowment to do a lot of text work. And so everybody was excited because of this huge amount of money that was being spent to do all this critical text work with all the different manuscripts that had been discovered to date. But von Soden used a totally different method. He didn't use the same way of notation. He didn't use the same families that Griesbach and Lachmann and Tregelles and Tischendorf and Alford and Wordsworth had used. He departed totally from it. And then what made it worse is that the people he had working for him made mistakes and there wasn't enough oversight. So the mistakes that they made in collation made their way into von Soden's text. So after all this money was spent, they came out with something that was unusable by most people who were schooled in all the other ways of doing things, from the Lachmann to Tregelles, Tischendorf, Alford, and Wordsworth crowd. His work still is valuable, but you have to learn a totally different way of looking at things. He has different text families. He has different ways of abbreviating the manuscripts. So it's totally different. Eberhard Nestle's son, Erwin Nestle, took over from his father, and he published the critical text versions 13 through 25. And Kurt Aland began in 1952 to work for Edwin Nestle, and he was his assistant for this 21st version. In 1979, he took over the project and published the Nestle Aland 26th edition. He brought in evidence from the papyrus documents. Now, this is interesting. See, most of the texts that had been used up to this point were the vellum and the parchment, etc. The papyrus texts had not yet been discovered. They started showing up at the end of the 19th century when people went out into Egyptian trash heaps and found Bible texts and other things. Another thing that was found at this time were just ordinary papyrus documents, grocery lists, and legal documents. You know, when people passed away, they'd throw away all their documents. And so in Egypt, it was so dry that they had these ancient trash heaps, 30, 40 feet tall, outside the city. And so they started going through it, and they found all of these documents, not just, they found Bible manuscripts, but they found other documents that had the Greek on it, and they saw how people wrote. They saw what their vocabulary was. Because before this time, people thought that the language of the Bible was a special kind of Greek because they didn't have any other representatives of it. They had the classical Greek, which was the Iliad and the Odyssey and Aristotle and Plato, but the Greek language had changed substantially, just like King James has changed till now. You know, we don't say thee and thou anymore. We don't use some of the words that they used because our language has changed in the last 400 years. Greek had also changed, but they didn't have very many examples of the same kind of Greek that was in the Bible until they discovered all these papyrus documents, and they found out that the Greek of the Bible was the common Greek of the time, called Koine, common Greek, Koine Greek. They found a bunch of papyrus documents in something called a geniza. A geniza was a special storage place in synagogues where they put Bibles. When they were worn out, they would accumulate Bibles, anything with the Word of God in it, even if it was a letter, if it had the word God in it, was sacred. And so they couldn't just throw them out. Their tradition was they would give them to the synagogue, they would be put in this geniza and stored, and then every 7 years they were ceremonially buried or burned or whatever. But they found a geniza in Cairo in a Christian building that had been destroyed, and inside were over 1 million documents in papyrus. So it was a treasure trove. Bible manuscripts, all kinds of stuff. And so there was a huge amount of information that they derived. Many scholars got doctor's degrees studying this stuff and seeing all kinds of different things. So Kurt Aland brought in the evidence from the papyrus documents into his critical text. And they are now working on a huge computerized database with everything they can find in it. They have Kurt Aland maintained the official list of all of the texts, and it's in German. It's the Kurzgefasste Liste der griechischen Handschriften des Neuen Testaments. That's German. He's got the official list. Like, remember, Johann, what was his name? He went around Europe and found all of those texts and made that index. That index passed through all the hands until it became officially done by Kurt Aland. And so they're making a computerized database with everything in it, so they're going to be able to search everything, and his wife is overseeing that. The Edito Critica Major, the major critical edition. And what they want to do is publish that, but what they're going to do, they've learned their lesson from the Textus Receptus crowd, so what they're going to do is they're going to compare it to Textus Receptus, so it'll still have Textus Receptus in it, so they won't get condemned by these kooks. Also, you have the UBS text that was put together by a group of scholars, and so the two major critical texts today are the Nestle-Aland text and the UBS text. Now, also, there's another newer critical text made by Zane Hodges and Arthur Farstad. They are in the Textus Receptus group, and so they're trying to say the majority is better. So they have proposed a majority text based upon the evidence from the later texts. There also is another one by Maurice Robinson and William Pierpont, published in 2003, which is the Greek New Testament according to the Byzantine text form. This also is a Textus Receptus favorable version. But that'll give you an idea of what stands behind the critical text. So that's how we got the Bible that we have. For example, the New English Bible, or the NASB, or the NIV, they were translated from the UBS critical text. The 1881 version of the Bible, that was translated from Westcott and Hort's text. There were some other versions of the Bible translated from Tischendorf, but most of the earliest versions came from the Stephens. So that'll give you an idea of how we got the Bibles that we have now. And so when you say it's not in the critical Greek text, now you know a little bit more about it. But always prove it! Bless you.